up.
Thank you. Welcome to our Kolot Kehilla this morning. We have been talked by Daniel Stolz on the Islamic response to the pandemic. And we have a brunch, which is a tour through the Islamic world. If we start here, we have an Egyptian dish called nargesi. Nargesi is sort of Egyptian shakshush with spinach instead of tomatoes, made with the spinach, turmeric, and cayenne. We have some naan bread from Pakistan, some pita from the Middle East. We have a fool. A fool is simmered beans which are mashed, and it's used as a dip. We have some sfen, which is an Egyptian donut, very much like a sufganiyot, since Hanukkah is about to come. From Nigeria, we have a dodo, which are fried plantains, marinated in lime and red onion. From Persia, we have a carrot marabo, which is a carrot preserve. Also from Persia, we have a greens which are sauteed with red onion and raisins, and squash seeds. We have some peanuts for garnish, some green onions for garnish, some yogurt for whatever. We have a bean dish. This is lubia, which is a common bean, a bean stew, which is common to much of the Islamic world. We have here a dish, which is a rice dish from Indonesia called nasi uduk, which is rice cooked in coconut milk, coriander, and lemongrass, topped with a peanut sauce and with sambal ulik and fried onions. We also have some walnuts, some raisins, some hummus, some pistachios, some extra fried onions, and some extra peanut sauce for the rice, some dates, and some cucumbers with za'atar. We have some limes and lemons for garnish. For our beverage, we have a Moroccan mint tea, which is a green gunpowder tea with spearmint, which is heavily sugared. It's almost like a syrup. This is our brunch menu for this morning, all done in Adrian's kitchen. And we're looking forward to Daniel Stolz and his talk. Daniel is the Kehilla Karpat Assistant Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin. He is a historian of the late Ottoman Empire and the emergence of the modern Middle East. He received his bachelor's degree from Harvard and his PhD from Princeton and came to us from Northwestern. He was a Fulbright scholar in Egypt and comes to us today to talk about how Islam views pandemics through history and how they've handled the pandemic, which is currently occurring in 2020. Day Essen, and on to our talk. Thank you.
Beautiful, Barry. Who's eating all that this morning?
It's just Adrian and I. Nobody else in our semi cohort can come. Some people are self-quarantining right now.
Well, the recipes are also available in the email that we sent for Kolot Kehilla.
They're easy to follow, by the way. And
they're very quick recipes.
That is so gorgeous.
Except the naan bread. that takes some time, not that it's hard.
It is so gorgeous. I want to jump into my screen and eat all of that.
Very beautiful. Wow. I've eaten full in Nablus.
Okay, good.
Has the Rabbinical Assembly figured out a way to jump into a Zoom screen yet?
No, we're just getting worse and worse.
Go to your email.
Well, it looks amazing. Your presentation and your dishes and your platters are beautiful.
The copper platter is of an Arab artist.
So the other thing that I want to say is I want to check in with Dan for a moment. And I'm going to put this also in the chat room. Dan will be taking questions, and people can use the chat feature to submit your question to Dan, the session host. And he will also be running his slideshow, his PowerPoint. But Dan, do you want to take questions at the end? Or do you think that you'll be kind of peeking at the chat room, and if you notice, you'll field questions throughout? Any way you want to do it is,
Yeah.
I'd say do what's easiest for you.
I think since I'll be sharing my screen, I may not have a close eye on the chat. So
Okay.
the easiest thing I think would be just to hold the questions for the end. There should be plenty of time.
Yeah.
But it's fine if people would like to enter questions in the chat, either as a way of just remembering a question for later, or on the chance that I might actually see it while I'm talking. That's fine with me too. But I might not take the questions till the end.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll keep my eye also on it in case the chat room, it starts moving up. So I'll keep my eye out on it also for you. So Barry and Adrian, was it easy to get the ingredients for this?
There was one or two we had to order, but basically all of these things. Well,
None of what we ordered was in this meal.
Right.
We ordered some things because we were going to try some other dishes.
Yeah, he's right. And then we decided not to because they were too difficult to get the ingredients for. So, I mean, everything in here is
Other
very
than
simple.
that, I discovered that Metcalf's does carry lemongrass. That was the most difficult ingredient. And they also carry plantains. But they aren't very ripe, so you have to plan about 2 weeks ahead of time so your plantain ripens.
And how did you guys research what dishes you decided to?
Well, we looked on all, I mean, we have an enormous number of different cookbooks here from all over. So we were able to look at those, and we also looked on the internet. So, I mean, there's some of the dishes that are used everywhere, from Egypt to India. We're trying to find what would be the simplest recipe that really took in all of their characteristics, and we found those. It was really fascinating to locate these.
I will make one comment, at least to my taste. Most of the recipes we found were under seasoned, and really the seasoning needed adjustment.
Yeah, we jarred it up a little.
And how many hours and days did you get together? How long did it take for you to
I would
get it all
say there's 40 to 60 hours of our time involved in this.
Wow.
But that's also that goes back to researching it, deciding on what to do, and so on, and then and doing the shopping and other things for it. And I have to say, I don't even go out anymore at all. Bear got what was needed, and it's a very a lot of these are very simple things. So the nuts and things are things that everybody has in their house, cucumbers, green onions. And as far as the making naan or pita bread, the difference between the naan and the pita bread was the naan gets fried, the pita bread is put in the oven and goes up fast. It's the same exact dough.
Oh,
So you can do both. I mean, it's very interesting to find out how these different cultures, how something takes a certain form in one culture and a slightly different form in another culture. In India and Pakistan, it's naan.
And as you go to the Far East, we find lemongrass coming in Southeast Asia and Indonesia, whereas it's cumin and coriander in North Africa.
Yeah, it's actually very fascinating to follow these. I think one of the most interesting things for myself that came out, because I think it's gorgeous, is this carrot. They called it a jam, but it's not a jam.
It's maraba, but it's really a carrot preserve. And you grate carrots and you cook them for hours with a lot of sugar, a 2-to-1 ratio of sugar to carrots.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how these people don't all have massive diabetes, because the amount of sugar and syrup that goes into everything is unbelievable.
I think what was interesting is that I hadn't fried plantains before in all my years. I've never been that attracted to them. I'm still not overly attracted to them. But
they're okay.
But marinated with a lot of lime juice and red onion, it really does have some flavor.
But you know something that's very interesting? Plantains are actually more abundant in use than the bananas that we know. They're used like potatoes through much of the world.
I have a one of those round mats to put the pills on.
Don't you have it?
Yeah.
Oops, Sally and yeah, you guys needed to mute. So everybody, so you know, we are recording this, and Barry and Adrian had just shown in the first few minutes after 9:45 the complete and amazing and beautiful brunch of foods. So if you want to, you'll be able to go back and see that part because it looks amazing and beautiful garnishes. And I'm also letting you know, I was told by Maureen and John Minor that the community pharmacy and Willie Co-op both carry bulk lemongrass. So there's a plug for our organic natural places. And then also just before we start, I'm letting you guys know that on January 10th, Mark Hoplovich is going to be our next Kolot Kehilla presenter. So please mark your calendars and look forward to that. And on April 11th, Kathy Johnson Rock and Michael Rock will be presenting Gardening for Hummingbirds.
Oh,
So we'll mention that again at the end.
But you're the only one.
So there you go. So Barry, if you could do one more intro in a few seconds for all of our people who are now logging in to the beginning of Dan Stolz's presentation, and then Dan will take it from there. And then we're going to ask that everybody stays muted during Dan's presentation, and please use the chat feature to submit your questions, because Dan will take questions at the end.
Well, thank you all for joining us this morning for our Kolot Kehilla. Our presentation this morning is from a relatively new member of our congregation, Daniel Stolz, better known as the husband of Rabbi Greenberg. At least from the temple's point of view, not from the university's point of view. Daniel is assistant professor of history at the University of Wisconsin. He is an expert on the history of the Ottoman Empire, especially the late Ottoman Empire and the emergence of the modern Middle East. He's written a very interesting book that I need to get a hold of, The Lighthouse and the Observatory, which is Islam, Science, and Empire in Ottoman Egypt. He received his bachelor's degree from Harvard University, and received a PhD from Princeton, where he was awarded the prize for the outstanding dissertation of the year. He was a Fulbright Fellow in Egypt and now comes to us to share his expertise on the Ottoman Empire, Islam, the pandemics in history in the Ottoman Empire and Islam, and how modern Islam has responded to the current pandemic. Thank you. And now, Dr. Stolz.
Thanks so much. And thank you, Barry, for the introduction and for the invitation as well. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes.
I'm going to take a moment now to share my screen properly. Let me just say in the meantime that it's really nice to see so many Beth Israel friends, many of you. It's hard to believe I haven't seen you in 9 months or more. It's nice to see also some family joining from New York. Welcome. Okay, so I believe here we are. Can everyone see that screen properly? Great.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you to Deb as well in particular for your help getting set up here. All right, so our topic is the pandemic, the current COVID-19 pandemic in Muslim communities. And I thought I would begin by pointing out what all of you already know or intuitively understand about the topic of this talk. To begin with, the pandemic is, among other things, a religious issue. You are, I'm sure, well aware that the pandemic has posed difficult questions, sometimes novel questions for American Jewish communities, right? What should we be doing in person? How should we modify our practices to make them safer? What can we do online in a meaningful way? How to maintain a commitment to things like Shabbat and social justice when we are physically withdrawn from society. I think 9 months into the pandemic, these have become familiar questions, even if they have not gotten any easier. You are perhaps also aware that some Jewish communities have objected to, and in some cases refused to comply with, public health orders, as have any number of American churches, both Catholic and evangelical. So the pandemic is a religious issue, clearly. But if my own social circles are any indication, the American Jewish community, I think, is largely unaware of the experience of the pandemic among the world's 2 billion Muslims, whether it's the ones who are our neighbors in Wisconsin, those elsewhere in the US and other countries where Muslims live as a religious minority, or whether we look to the Muslim majority countries across parts of Africa, the Middle East, and South and Southeast Asia. It seems to me we're just not talking about this a whole lot. And I think we should be talking about it for at least a couple of reasons. First of all, it's a global pandemic, right? And Muslims are, the inhabitants, about a quarter of the inhabitants of that globe. So just on the grounds of being informed about world events, this is something I think we should be talking about. And moreover, from the perspective of a Jewish community in particular, it's worth saying that Muslims, right, are representatives of a tradition with extensive shared history and parallels to Jewish tradition. And so for both of these reasons, I thought it would be useful and perhaps illuminating to provide some basic information and some preliminary analysis of some of the ways in which Muslims have been affected by and responded to the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm going to begin by briefly explaining my own perspective on this topic, how it relates to my research area. And then I'll put up the specific questions that I'll be addressing in the talk. So I come to this topic as someone who has researched the history of Islam and science. I wrote my first book on science and Islamic practice in Egypt in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Barry was kind enough to mention it, so I'll show you a picture of it. There it is. Looks great on the shelf, even if you don't make your way all the way through it. I've also published a little on the history of Hajj travel, Muslim pilgrimage travel, during the cholera pandemic of the mid-19th century. So I come to this topic really as a historian of Islam. My expertise, to be clear, is not in medicine or in public health. So this talk is not going to be drawing on the preliminary public health and medical literature that you start to see coming out of places like Turkey and Bangladesh right now, as well as Iran. I'll be drawing instead on really on historical scholarship on disease in Islamic society, as well as journalistic accounts from a variety of Muslim communities in the last 9 months. Okay, so here are the main questions I hope to cover in the next half hour or so. And then of course, there'll be time for your own questions as well. So first, I'll provide a long-term historical perspective, looking at 2 of the major episodes of epidemic disease that Muslim communities experienced prior to the 20th century. And I think a long-term historical perspective is helpful here because when we come to this second question of how Muslims have adapted specific religious practices during the current pandemic, I think we'll find that they have done so partly in conversation with a set of legal and ethical debates that actually extend back across Islamic history. At the same time, we'll also find that a long-term historical perspective is of somewhat limited use when it comes to understanding some of the diversity of ways, really divergent ways in which Muslim communities today are responding to the pandemic. And that's because in addition to thinking about long-term historical factors, we also need to think about political divisions and social inequalities, which are also historically produced, but tend to be of more recent genesis. So, and this is another one of those points, right, about the pandemic, which I'm sure is familiar, right? We know that the pandemic can exacerbate existing political divisions and social inequalities. And the same thing is happening in Islamic contexts, only the divisions and inequalities might be less familiar. So that's the final point that we'll come to before the Q&A. Okay, so a long-term historical perspective on epidemic disease in Islamic history. The notion of a widespread disease has a very long history in Islamic legal, ethical, and medical writing. So waba would be the Arabic term that I'm translating here as epidemic disease, and it has cognates in other major languages of Islamic scholarship like the Turkish veba. Likewise, the fact that such diseases pose particular challenges to communal life has a very long history in Islamic writing. That history does not determine contemporary responses to COVID-19, but it certainly has informed those responses, as we'll see. I'll mention today 2 diseases, the experience of 2 diseases that particularly shaped Islamic discourses on how to respond to an epidemic, and those are bubonic plague and cholera. So the bubonic plague was probably the largest historical event in terms of producing and forming early Islamic discourses on epidemic disease and how to respond to them. The bubonic plague may be known to you as the Black Death, which struck Europe in the mid-14th century and killed something like 1/3 of the continent's population. The plague also struck around the Mediterranean, including the Western Islamic kingdoms in Morocco and southern Iberia at that time. And it became especially recurrent in the Ottoman-ruled cities of the Eastern Mediterranean, in Egypt, in essentially the greater Syrian lands, Anatolia, and in the Balkans. So that's a Turkish and Ottoman funeral procession in that image from the mid-16th century there. So the point here is there was a centuries-long encounter between at least the Mediterranean Islamic world and this widespread and particularly deadly disease. And that encounter, not surprisingly, generated new arguments and new ideas in several kinds of Islamic writing. From the 14th century onward, we find Muslim scholars writing plague treatises, such as the work of the 14th century Moroccan Wazir Ibn al-Khatib. We find the plague also referenced repeatedly in Islamic legal writing from these centuries, especially between the 14th and 16th centuries, including fatwas, which are kind of analogous to the rabbinic genre of teshuvot or responsa. They are answers from individual and highly respected Muslim scholars to individuals who have a particular question about a circumstance that they're facing. We also interestingly find the plague mentioned in the work of hadith commentators in these centuries. The hadith are the reports and sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad and his companions. And after the Quran, they are the principal source of Islamic law. I want to highlight a few key features that emerge from these early debates and discussions of the bubonic plague. First, one of the central questions that Muslims debated again and again beginning in the 14th century was whether it is acceptable and perhaps even advisable to flee from a city that is experiencing an outbreak. And that debate never really reached a consensus, but it helped to clarify a tension between two deeply rooted values. On the one hand, the duty to preserve life militated against remaining in, certainly against entering, an area infected with plague. To the extent it was believed that residing in a plague-ridden city placed one's life in danger, and by the way, that question about transmission is itself a fascinating one that gets debated in these sources. We can talk about that in the Q&A for those who are interested. But to the extent it was believed that residing in a plague-ridden city placed one's life in greater danger, then avoiding that circumstance was commendable and perhaps even obligatory. On the other hand, the duty to care for the sick provided a powerful imperative not to flee the plague and to remain in the circumstances of an outbreak. Second, the debates over bubonic plague produced a new emphasis in some Islamic writing on the notion of communal interest as a legal principle. Communal interest, sometimes the term one sees as maslaha in Arabic, and in particular on the goal of preserving life as one of the controlling goals or objectives of Islamic law is something that comes to be articulated in many of these responses, some of these responses to the bubonic plague. Finally, the discussions of bubonic plague in Islamic writing led to a re-examination of early Islamic history, going back all the way to the 7th century in search of precedent for how to deal with this very difficult circumstance. And so in light of the bubonic plague, for example, statements that were attributed to the Prophet Muhammad regarding whether or not certain diseases are transmissible come to be mined for evidence as to whether remaining in a plague-ridden city in fact placed one's life in danger or not. Likewise, the fact that one of the early Muslim caliphs or successors to the Prophet Muhammad was said to have avoided or refrained from entering a plague-ridden city comes to be interpreted as a precedent for how to respond to the bubonic plague by some commentators. So there's a kind of rereading of earlier history that happens in light of the plague experience. I want to highlight before we move on just this notion of communal interest and the preservation of life as a goal of Islamic law as something that we'll particularly see kind of carries over into contemporary discussions. Okay, the other major historical experience which had a formative effect on Islamic discourses on epidemic disease was the cholera pandemic, or technically speaking, several pandemics of the 19th century. What's significant about the 19th century cholera is that not only did it decimate a number of large Muslim communities, especially in the Middle East and South Asia, but also in contrast to the bubonic plague, cholera came to have a strong association with a specifically Islamic event, namely, of course, the Hajj, the annual pilgrimage to Mecca in Western Arabia. The 19th century, of course, was the first age of steam travel. And in that context, the Hajj became a much larger event. And of particular relevance for cholera were the increasing numbers of Hajjis, pilgrims, traveling to the Middle East from the Indian Ocean ports, most of them under British or Dutch imperial rule at that time. And they were traveling not only in greater numbers, but also in greater density on steamships. Now, exactly how the connection between Hajj and cholera transmission was understood in the 19th century is itself another one of these complex and fascinating topics, which is a bit tangential to the discussion today, although again, I'd be happy to return to it in the Q&A. What I want to highlight for now is the fact that the Hajj became the occasion actually for one of the first forms of international public health cooperation in the modern era. The Third International Sanitary Conference, which itself was kind of one of the predecessors to the WHO, met in Istanbul in 1866 and devised a system of quarantine, which was meant to spread prevent the spread of cholera from South Asia into the Red Sea and from the Middle East into the Mediterranean. So you can see here in a page from the Indian Medical Gazette from the early 20th century, some of the facilities at the quarantine station in El Tur, which is a city on the Gulf of Suez, kind of on the Sinai Peninsula, kind of near Sharm el-Sheikh, but on the western side of the peninsula. Many Muslim pilgrims would have had to spend time here making Hajj in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The implementation of Red Sea quarantine in the late 19th century was not surprisingly tied up in the political history of that time, right? So between the 1830s and 1880s, the French colonize Algeria and Tunisia. The British occupy Egypt. The British Indian Empire expands onto the eastern shores of the southern and eastern shores of the Arabian Peninsula. And also you have the rise of modernizing governments in the Ottoman Empire, both in Istanbul and in Cairo, all of which is to say that quarantine in the 19th century was in a sense, was just part of a larger political context in which migration in this part of the world between the Mediterranean and Indian Oceans was just coming under much greater surveillance in general. And so the cholera pandemics of that time are noteworthy for our purposes because for the first time you start to get arguments about the imposition of public health measures around a specific Islamic duty, the pilgrimage, as well as a sense that those impositions right now are coming from authorities outside the community, right? Be it Muslim political leaders in the Middle East or colonial powers. Some Muslim authorities in the 19th century legitimated the new quarantine regulations, specifically by returning to the precedent of the earlier Islamic responses to the bubonic plague. So for example, this is where the earlier idea that it is appropriate to flee from epidemic disease becomes more closely translated into the rather different response of quarantine, right? Again, on the grounds that preservation of life is a controlling objective of Islamic law. Okay, so there are, of course, other historical epidemics in Islamic history, that we could consider, including more recent epidemics, the 1918 flu, HIV for that matter. But I think the main points to take away from a long-term historical perspective on epidemic disease in Islamic history are several, right? First, that the notion itself of epidemic disease is extremely well established for many centuries in Islamic thought. So too is the notion that communal behaviors sometimes need to be modified in response to an epidemic. And finally, I want to underscore that the exact contours of an appropriate response to an epidemic was never a matter of consensus, right? It's not as though there's a single Islamic position on the epidemic that emerges from these long-term discussions. Rather, it was a question debated within a kind of increasingly well-defined matrix of competing values and precedents, among which the preservation of life was an important principle, though not the only one. And I think this historical perspective can help us understand really the first fundamental fact of COVID-19 in relation to Islam, which is that Muslim communities have overwhelmingly implemented public health measures pretty similar to what we've seen around the world for the last 9 months, particularly with respect to social distancing. So I'm going to talk about a few different kind of adaptations and responses with respect to specific Islamic practices in the current moment. Okay, so starting in March, Muslim communities around the world began to cancel in-person prayers, actually in some cases starting in February. These included the 5 regular daily prayers, as well as the Friday Jummah prayers, which carry a special obligation to be performed collectively. The image on the screen here is the action plan prepared by the Islamic Society of Milwaukee, our state's largest Muslim organization, at the very beginning of the pandemic. It probably looks a bit familiar to those of you on the synagogue's COVID committee, right? They're preparing this before the first lockdowns here. And what they are basically saying is that, you know, we as a mosque or a masjid are going to follow government recommendations. There will be no activities at the masjid, the mosque, in the event of federal, state, or local emergency orders. The Fiqh Council of North America, which is the legal advisory body to the Islamic Society of North America, it's kind of like the CJLS of North American Islam, issued a set of guidelines on prayer and other rituals. And I'll read from one of the things they said here. They said, the suspension of the communal prayers in the masjids and all religious activities in person is a necessary matter in light of the overall goals of the Sharia. And not only is there no sin in doing so, rather it is sinful to flout such regulations and bring risk to oneself and others. Of the primary goals of the Sharia is the preservation of life. Okay, so notice here, right, the invocation of this vocabulary that we saw going back to the debates over bubonic plague in the 14th century, in which the preservation of life is invoked as a controlling goal that overrides or supersedes ordinary obligations. North American Muslims were hardly unusual in adopting this attitude. Just to take a prominent example from the Middle East, Iran, which was the earliest and hardest hit country in the Middle East in terms of the pandemic, closed its mosques starting in February and did not reopen them until the end of May, and has periodically closed them since in response to additional waves. Meanwhile, many communities have, of course, gathered online, broadcasting sermons online and so forth. But it's clear, according to most authorities, that online gathering does not substitute for collective gathering in person. So for those obligations, such as the Friday Jummah or collective prayers in particular, even where people are doing them online, the understanding kind of in informal terms, for those of you, interested in Islamic law, is that the duty to gather has been suspended, right? They're not substituting for it by meeting online. It has simply been suspended in light of the pandemic. Ramadan. Ramadan was a challenging month this year for a lot of people. It fell between April and May during the first lockdowns in many places. And Ramadan, of course, is a month of fasting, but it's also a month of communal gathering for iftar, the breaking of the fast every evening, for the special evening prayers called the tarawih that happen after iftar every evening. And in general, it's a time for being with family and friends, right? It's a holiday, right? Much of that either went online or simply didn't happen this year. This is a picture from a really wonderful ABC News visual essay on Ramadan from the spring. This is a picture from the West Bank of a woman sharing iftar with her husband on the phone. He's a nurse taking care of COVID patients in a Palestinian hospital, I believe near Hebron. In Iran, people attended drive-in prayer services after iftar. So those people are not at a Joe Biden rally. They're at Tarawih prayers in Iran. during Ramadan. In Indonesia, prominent Muslim clerics called on their followers not to travel for what's called mudik, which is a specifically Indonesian Muslim practice of returning to one's hometown for Eid al-Fitr, the holiday at the end of Ramadan. So for migrant workers in Indonesia in particular, this is a widespread practice that many suspended this year of going back home for Eid. Meanwhile, a number of interesting fatwas came out around Ramadan this year, again, legal rulings. For example, authorizing healthcare workers not to fast this year, and in some cases requiring people not to fast if they were experiencing symptoms. I think probably the most widely reported Islamic response to the pandemic was the closure of Saudi Arabia to pilgrims during the annual Hajj, which fell at the end of July this year. Only about 1,000 people participated in the event, all of them Saudi residents. So there was kind of an effort to balance between Saudi subjects and foreign residents in Saudi Arabia to kind of create like a representative Hajj, but it was less than 1,000 people participating. You can see them, 6 feet apart, circumambulating the Kaaba and one of the central Hajj rituals. Last year, the Hajj was 2 million people, just to give you some perspective on what it means to close Saudi Arabia to pilgrims, right? This is a central event for the Islamic world, for the Saudi government, right? And it basically didn't happen this year. And again, right, the fact that that this is not unprecedented in Islamic history, right? That actually many times, right, going back certainly to the 19th century cholera, you had substantial limitations placed on the Hajj. It, I think, was one of the right, historical factors that made this possible, right, for the Saudi government. As well as, I should mention, many other governments in Muslim majority countries which called on citizens not to travel for the Hajj. Well, so far I've kind of told a story in which Muslim communities are responding to the pandemic in much the way that the Beth Israel Center and many synagogues have participated, have responded, right? By emphasizing public health measures first and foremost. But obviously, just as there hasn't been a single uniform Jewish response to the pandemic, there has been plenty of diversity in the Islamic responses to COVID as well. But what I want to argue is that the divergences in Islamic responses to the pandemic have less to do with any kind of deep-seated doctrinal disagreements and much more to do with recent histories of political division and in some cases social inequalities as well. So I'm going to kind of do this on a sort of case study level, right? It's impossible to talk about the entire Islamic world. It's much too big, right? But I'm trying to be kind of eclectic and draw on a variety of geographic examples to give you a sense of some diversity. Within the world of Muslim majority countries, one of the important distinctions we need to bear in mind has to do with different ways in which modern nation states have sought to exercise religious authority. So one reason that Saudi Arabia and Iran, for example, were able to suspend regular religious activities, like closing mosques and suspending the Hajj, without significant opposition, is that these are countries in which the state enjoys a relatively high degree of control, at least over public Islamic discourse, albeit in different ways, right? So the Saudi monarchy does this through its long relationship to the scholars of what's sometimes called Wahhabi Islam, a relationship that goes back in some ways to the mid-18th century and which obviously became very lucrative for the clerics in Saudi Arabia since the rise in Saudi oil revenues in the 1970s. In Iran, the state's exercise of religious authority is grounded in the concept of an Islamic Republic, right, founded after the 1979 revolution, and which established a clerical hierarchy, right, understood as the guardian of the state's welfare. By contrast, I don't think anyone who studies modern Islam was surprised when Pakistan turned out to be one of the few Muslim majority countries in which COVID restrictions were broadly challenged on religious grounds. So you may be aware that in Pakistan, there was a very a public and protracted kind of negotiation between the government of Imran Khan, who's a former cricket player in Pakistan, and various kind of ulama councils and religious parties in Pakistan arguing over whether and how to close the mosques. Ultimately, the mosques were not closed, and instead mosque leaders agreed to a set of kind of operating procedures meant to slow the transmission of COVID in mosques. And those seem to have been pretty widely ignored. Again, right, this kind of contestation between the government and religious scholars and communal leaders, I think, was not surprising to observers, because Pakistan has long been home to some of the most contentious Islamic politics anywhere in the world. Pakistan, of course, was founded as a state for Muslims with the partition of British India in 1947, but it was not founded as an Islamic state. Right, and that's in strong contrast to the Saudi case, as well as the Iranian case after the 1979 revolution. In Pakistan, Muslim clerics were never well incorporated into the state. Instead, beginning with the military dictatorship of Zia al-Haq in the 1970s, a long line of Pakistani politicians have sought to bolster their legitimacy by positioning themselves as Islamic or kind of properly Muslim candidates and leaders, and to co-opt the religious parties like the Jamaat-e-Islami, one of the oldest religious parties in Pakistan. Meanwhile, the religious parties are themselves factionalized and compete with each other for credibility. And so there's a kind of highly fractious political environment in which it's very hard, right, to be the party that's calling for the closing of mosques, right? There's also, before I move on, there's also, I think, there's an important, well, let me say this. Islamic Authority in Pakistan also has a specific political economy, which helps explain what's going on there in terms of the difficulty of closing mosques. Most Pakistani mosque imams and higher ranking clerics depend financially on almsgiving from their communities. And most of that money is collected in mosques, right? It's not like paid as dues or something, right? It's collected in mosques, and much of it is paid during Ramadan, right? Which began in April this year, right? And so there was a kind of economically driven, I think, a resistance to the idea of closing mosques at that time, in contrast, say, to the Saudi case where scholars and imams receive public support. Another note on the economic context of closing mosques. In many parts of the world, in many communities, mosques feed a lot of people, right? They're really important centers for providing nutrition, right, and meals, especially during Ramadan, but even during other times of the year. And in that sense, closing mosques is a bit more like closing schools than it is like closing a synagogue, certainly in the United States. Some of you may have seen an interview back in April in the New Yorker with an imam in Philadelphia who talked about this explicitly, right? And the worries about closing the mosque, which was providing really essential nutritional services, food services to a lot of children in the community in particular. So we might also contrast that Pakistani case of kind of contestation over COVID restrictions with the case of Muslim communities that are religious minorities. Here I want to return to the United States. As much as we might want to and should, I think, applaud, our Wisconsin, neighbors here for adopting a similar public health emphasis as our own during the pandemic, I also want to suggest that we should think carefully about whether Muslims in the United States would even feel able to voice criticisms of the public health ordinances if they had such criticisms, right? It is remarkable that of the many legal challenges to public health orders in the US right now, right? They've come from Catholic churches, they've come from evangelical churches, they've come from synagogues, right? Pretty much none of them have come from Muslim communities. And we can explain that partly in terms of that long-term historical perspective I provided, right? And the fact that, responding to epidemic disease is a well-established notion in Islamic thought. But I think we also need to keep in mind, right, the much more recent and kind of post-September 11th history in which Muslim communities in the US were aggressively surveilled by law enforcement in ways that became quite public, especially in New York City, right? And just bear that in mind in thinking about whether Muslim American communities would even feel able, right, or to what degree they would feel able to voice criticisms or objections if they had them, right? So this is the homepage of the Islamic Society of Milwaukee, right? Some of you have probably seen it, right? Our mission is to be an exemplary American Muslim community, right? Is the first line that you encounter on that homepage, right? That is language which might well be at home on a synagogue webpage as well, but you'd probably be less likely to see it just because it wouldn't need to be said in the same way, right? This notion of being an exemplary American community. And so I think that's important to bear in mind as well. I'll say a quick word about ways in which the pandemic has related to social inequities in some Muslim communities. And again, I'll do this just through one specific kind of case study, which has to do with one of the starkest social inequalities anywhere certainly in the kind of Muslim majority countries, which has to do with the case of migrant workers in the Gulf states. As you may know, the oil-rich states in the Gulf region employ large numbers of migrant workers, construction laborers, service workers, domestic laborers, in some cases also skilled professions. It is impossible for those workers to obtain naturalization in those countries, and they enjoy limited access to social services, including healthcare and particularly quality housing. In some countries like Saudi Arabia, the laws that such migrant workers kind of live under essentially place them at the mercy of their employers, who control not only where they work, but even where they live. And so it was no surprise that that kind of the epicenter of the first wave of infection in many Gulf countries was these migrant worker populations who live in very close quarters. There have been some signs of efforts to improve the status of migrant workers at the structural level in response to the experience of the pandemic in the Gulf states. Saudi Arabia in particular has kind of reopened the issue of what's called the Kehilla laws, which kind of govern the relationship between migrant workers and their employers. So there are some kind of positive signs that the pandemic may be drawing attention to the status of these workers in a way that may drive some reforms. But the jury is certainly still out, and migrant workers, for example, were excluded from the Saudi kind of stimulus or aid bill earlier this year. Meanwhile, the pandemic, not surprisingly, has provided cover for any number of countries in this part of the world to kind of continue on political crackdowns that were already well underway. The case of Egypt, where increasing number of journalists have been detained during the pandemic as part of a kind of general crackdown on information in that context, comes to mind as well. We can talk about other examples during the Q&A. I promised myself I would not end on a depressing note, so I'll end on a note of optimism, or at least creativity. This is an image from Culver City in Los Angeles earlier in the spring. As part of the response to the lockdowns and to the suspension of prayer in mosques, many municipalities in the United States, especially in Southern California, in Canada, I believe also in Germany and the Netherlands and some other European countries possibly, municipalities suspended or rather, let me put it this way, municipalities granted permission to mosques to broadcast the call to prayer for the first time, to issue the azan, the call to prayer, over loudspeakers. This is a very common sound in many countries, but not in the United States, right? It's not common to hear the Muslim call to prayer over loudspeakers, across the city. I grew up going to school maybe 2 blocks from a mosque, and I think I never heard the call to prayer except maybe once when I happened to be walking right by at the right time. But in a number of North American and European cities, in response to the suspension of gathering in mosques, cities allowed the mosques to broadcast the call to prayer over loudspeakers so that people could hear it from their homes. And these are Muslims, or at least several of them, right, kind of taking videos of that in Los Angeles in the spring, right? So there's been plenty of innovation and creativity and of the kind that you might see in synagogue communities, right, in response to kind of how to meaningfully be together, even when, of course, right, we can't be together. So I'll wrap up on that relatively positive note and look forward to your questions. Let me stop the share here. Okay. All right, I'm having a chance now to review the chat for the first time.
There's 2 questions there, Dan.
Yeah, absolutely. And please, Deb, do you want people to only use the chat for the questions, or?
I think that let's start with the chat, and then if there's someone who maybe isn't comfortable using it, then we can find out, and they can flag us with their hand.
Okay, great. Okay, all right. Well, okay, yeah, this was a lot of fun, as it were. Talking about the pandemic, right? So
if you want to read the question first.
Yeah, so there's a question about, excuse me, the historical Islamic view of disease transmission and how that has affected contemporary perspectives. One reason I kind of brushed over this is that I actually don't think there's a lot of continuity between the kind of late medieval or early modern kind of debates over transmission and the response today. There is an extended debate, particularly in the context of the bubonic plague, among Muslim scholars over whether it was contagious in the sense of being transmissible between people. That debate engaged with kind of the Galenic medical tradition, humoral medical tradition that medicine in the whole Mediterranean world really was based on at that time, whether in the Latin world or the Islamic world. It engaged also with sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, who interestingly, had a lot to say about disease transmission in certain contexts. But because of the way that biomedicine was so thoroughly adapted in pretty much all Muslim parts of the world in the 19th century and the early 20th century, those debates really just don't carry over in any clear way into contemporary debates about transmission and contagion. And those debates, even as a precedent, are a bit complicated by the fact that bubonic plague actually it's not like really directly transmissible between people in most cases. So it's just a very kind of ambiguous precedent to work with. Contagion, I guess the final thing I would say about that is that, in the pre-modern context, one of the reasons that contagion, the notion of disease transmission, was so hotly debated is that it was associated from some Muslim perspectives with a kind of superstition, right? Kind of like this notion of kind of unseen forces, right? That are not divinely ordered, right? That kind of affect health and illness. It was kind of associated with the evil eye. But again, I wouldn't emphasize, that there's any kind of strong continuity from those debates to the contemporary response. Josh has a question here about different structures within Islamic spaces and vaccination.
I'm going to interrupt you for just a moment. And after you're done with Josh's question, go back before Bill, because Phyllis also had a question before him.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, thank you.
Okay. You just have to scooch up a little.
Thank you.
Nope.
Yeah, I haven't. So the question from Josh is about how different structures within Islamic spaces might be conducive to vaccination or might challenge vaccination in terms of distribution and logistics. Here, I think, I think the more recent histories of political division, or the political histories and social histories of specific countries and communities, I think is going to be a lot more relevant than any kind of long-term like Islamic perspective on vaccination. Certainly, vaccination has a really long history in some kind of Islamic context, right? Smallpox inoculation and actually originated in some ways in Turkey, right? And was introduced in a widespread way in parts of the Middle East in the 19th century. So there's a kind of longstanding kind of public health infrastructure in parts of the world there, right, for vaccinating people. But there are also complicated political histories, right? In Pakistan, right, for example, the fact that public health infrastructure, right, was used by certainly, there's a widespread belief, right, that the CIA and intelligence agencies, right, used public health infrastructure to surveil Pakistani society in the hunt for Osama bin Laden and other Al-Qaeda figures in the early part of this century is a well-remembered issue in that country that contributes to the politics of kind of public health initiatives there. Let's see if there's a response to that. No. Yeah, so I think it really depends on the specific community and kind of the politics of vaccination and of public health programs more broadly in specific communities. I will say that one kind of positive development we've seen in terms of public health infrastructure, or really the absence of a negative development, is that the pandemic, so far at least, has not been as bad in some refugee communities as was originally feared. So you may know, right, one of the largest, I think the largest refugee camp right now is in Bangladesh, right, where the Muslims who have fled the Rohingya, right, Muslims who have fled persecution in Myanmar, right, there was a real fear that population would be decimated by the pandemic, and so far, at least according to what I've read from the Hopkins humanitarian health studies that have come out of there, it hasn't been as bad as expected, possibly because of the relative youth of that population. Okay, so there was an earlier question about were Jews accused of causing or spreading bubonic plague in Ottoman Islamic lands the way that they were in Christian Europe? So I guess it's actually a two-part question, right? Were they accused, and were they accused in the way that they were in Christian Europe? So I think I would answer that as kind of yes and no, right? So yes, there absolutely, were instances, right, in which that association was made, right, and it has to do in part with the kind of the reputation and right of those communities for travel, right, and circulation, and the way that they're connected, right, or were connected across the Mediterranean. But it did not become the specific kind of issue that it did in terms of the development of anti-Semitism in Europe. Just to connect that back to kind of what's happening right now, you actually see, right, in some countries where, in Southeast Asia in particular, where Muslims are religious minorities, they have come under kind of similar suspicion, right, for spreading COVID-19 as being kind of the communities that are responsible for spreading the pandemic. This happened in Cambodia, is the country that I'm thinking of in particular, where there was kind of a large group of Muslims who were one of the first to be kind of identified publicly as kind of positive cases, and this has been responsible for some kind of heightened instances of Islamophobia in some countries, where the idea is that kind of Muslim travel is kind of what's spreading the pandemic. Okay.
Jelinex have two different.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I'm going to read them aloud also.
Yeah, just trying to see if I can group these into some thematic clusters. Oh, there's just a kind of factual question about the photo of the Hajj, the several lines of people with the parasols, which are just sun, covers. I'm not aware of the significance of the color. They may well have a significance, but I'm not aware of it. It's an interesting question. In terms of, there was a question about the HIV pandemic. Right, so a couple of factors there. Which again, I think carry over into the current moment. So one thing which allowed some countries to, or has allowed some countries to kind of control the spread of HIV, right, is the fact that these, a lot of countries, certainly in kind of Muslim majority countries, right, overlap with countries that, have very, and certainly in the 1980s and 90s had quite authoritarian political regimes. And so it was not uncommon, right, at that time for people to be excluded, right, from entry without HIV tests. But at the same time, the willingness of governments, here I'm thinking particularly of the Middle East, to kind of exploit homophobia in the interest of kind of garnering, some kind of credibility, right, and sort of goodwill with certain religious factions, right, has also meant ignoring, right, certain populations that were particularly vulnerable to that pandemic in its early period, and in fact to this day. And so there, this is something that goes beyond the Islamic world, obviously, right? But the inequities in access to healthcare enjoyed by gay and queer and transgender people, right, are certainly pronounced in the Middle East and South Asia. So that's certainly been part of the HIV response as well. Yes, so a question about food distribution from Betsy, and then I'll try to come back to some of the earlier questions. Yeah, absolutely, mosques, I think not unlike synagogues, right, and churches, right, are definitely still feeding people, just doing it in a more remote way, right? So you'll have people gathering to kind of pack food and distribute food, right? But that food then goes out into the community rather than being consumed in the mosque. I have not seen any specific legal writing, Islamic kind of responsa on whether it is acceptable to eat non-halal food due to COVID-19 circumstances, but there are older Islamic responsa that legitimate kind of in general eating non-halal food under circumstances of necessity, particularly kind of in the context of kind of living as a religious minority. So I would imagine that those precedents may be drawn upon in those circumstances today as well, although I haven't seen it addressed specifically during the pandemic. A question from Rita about face covering and the fact that this is a normative practice for many Muslim women, and whether that's been helpful in preventing spread. I don't know, in part because, the public health studies, right, are really not my expertise. I don't know whether anyone, I haven't seen anyone look at that, whether the wearing of face coverings, may have been a factor in preventing spread. Of course, the hijab itself and the Islamic face covering is quite diverse in the way that it's practiced locally, and coverings that actually cover the mouth and nose are on the whole probably not as common as ones that cover the hair and the kind of surround the face. So it would be quite regional, and it would depend as well on class, since in many countries and communities the kind of face covering that's worn it's not just like a doctrinal thing, it's also an expression of kind of class and urban versus rural background and so forth. So I haven't seen those studies, but I would think they would have to be quite sensitive to the different ways in which the face covering is actually worn. Let's see if I've missed any questions here.
Francie Sapoznik,
Nancy.
right before the rabbi.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize the question was from Rabbi Betsy. I should have said from the rabbi. I'm sorry.
I didn't have a question.
Oh, it must have been from Betsy then.
Yeah, from
Oh,
Betsy.
that's it. I apologize. That's from Betsy. Sorry, Betsy.
Also Betsy, but no questions.
Okay. Where's Deb? If you see Nancy's question, would you mind just reading it? Because I am just having trouble finding it.
Yes. So Francie had asked, what have been your experiences and connections? What have they been with the Muslim community here in Madison? And what kind of Arabic do you speak?
Oh, Francis, sure. I speak Egyptian Arabic. My connections with the Muslim community here are not as strong as I'd like them to be, since I've only been here for 2.5 years, and almost one of them has been the pandemic. There is, of course, a community in Madison, even though the Milwaukee community is much larger. But my connections here are mostly with the Turkish community, which is a long-standing one here in Madison, and partly actually is why my position at the university in Ottoman history even exists.
Dan, I had a question about the situation in India, which is a Hindu majority country with a very large Muslim population. Just wondering.
Yes, thank you for drawing attention to that, and not just a large minority, but one which has been, in an increasingly precarious situation, right, under the Modi kind of Hindi nationalist government in recent years. I know that there have been, discussions between the Modi and Muslim leaders of the Indian Muslim community. I don't know. It's a big Islamic world out there, and it's not a case that I'm as familiar with in terms of how the pandemic is playing out there. I will say that in terms of kind of the longstanding social inequities in India since partition, right? Right, there are longstanding inequities in terms of how public services and public infrastructure are provided, right, to kind of predominantly Muslim areas and Hindi areas. So if you look at like the urban geography of Indian cities, right, very often like even basic things like the water infrastructure, right, is weaker, right, in areas that are predominantly Indian Muslim, and that kind of inequality, right, even if it has nothing to do with the pandemic, response immediately, right, certainly, right, is relevant, right, to how people experience the pandemic. So I will mention that. Luke has an article on the Indian situation. Yeah, I mean, I think, all of this information is coming out, it's, there's very little which has been written yet at a kind of scholarly peer-reviewed level about the pandemic in Muslim communities outside of public health literature, which does exist now and is looking at things like mental health infrastructure in Muslim majority countries and kind of mental health outcomes right now during COVID lockdowns, looking also at things like fasting during Ramadan and the management of kind of at-risk populations, people with diabetes, right, we know are particularly at risk for poor COVID outcomes. And there was some literature around that, particularly in light of the kind of fasting during Ramadan. So there is kind of some preliminary public health literature, but relatively little kind of looking in terms of kind of the religious and kind of broader social context and political context. I think we'll start to see it, soon. But in the meantime, it's mostly been a matter of just trying to keep track of all of the information coming out from journalists covering different parts of the world, as well as historians and other scholars who live in these parts of the world and have just kind of offered commentary on what's going on. There was one other comment I wanted to draw attention to. Oh, yeah, Josh mentions that there's been some discussion of the face covering issue in France, which of course has a long history of contesting the wearing of face coverings, right, with the effort to ban the face covering in public spaces, right, in France, right. So yeah, I'm sure that's been a very kind of irony laden and contested discussion there. Have I missed any other questions?
No,
Yeah.
I think you've got it. If anybody would like to chime in and unmute themselves, we still have, more than 10 minutes. Ending early is always okay. Francie has a question.
Well, I guess because my other graduate work was in linguistics, I'm always interested in this. So what do you find the interplay is for you between Arabic and Hebrew? I find it hard to deal with it, but I want to know how you do, whether it helps you or, and in some ways it can, or whether it interferes for you.
Sure. Hi, Francie. Yeah, I mean, they're related languages. They're both Semitic languages. The consonantal root, right, is the most basic shared feature that I think helps if you know one language in learning the other language, which otherwise is a foreign feature to, if you just have a background in Latin or Romance languages. There's some shared vocabulary, shared roots. I don't think there's any particular way in which kind of having some background in one language would be a hindrance to learning the other. But they're pretty different languages as well, right? And in particular, the diglossic nature of Arabic, right? The existence of the kind of standard written language across a very broad part of the world, right? Contrasted with the great diversity in spoken dialects, is a challenge with Arabic that you don't really have in Hebrew. I mean, the closest comparison would be like the difference between biblical Hebrew and Israeli Hebrew. But no one really learns to speak biblical Hebrew anyway, except maybe in some very specific like yeshivish circles. So and they actually don't really use it that way either. So so that's a big difference.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. It's interesting how much Arabic has come into modern Hebrew in Israel now.
It's not the same.
I see that Roz is unmuted. Did you have a question?
I don't know if I missed the beginning, but Dan, have you lived in the Middle East, or what is your background in that area? I'm sorry if you mentioned that at the beginning. I didn't catch it. Or what's your, how did you become interested in this area of the world?
Yeah, I spoke a little bit about my research background in Islam and science. I didn't speak about my personal experience. I've lived in terms of the Middle East, mostly in Egypt, Israel, spent some time in Morocco, a bit in Turkey, and traveled a little bit elsewhere as well. So, definitely in terms of my personal as well as research perspective on this topic, I have a bias toward thinking about the Middle East, which is, certainly not the largest, in terms of Muslim communities around the world, right? It's very often the region that we look to when we think about Islam, right? But but many more Muslims, right, live in South Asia and Southeast Asia, as well as Africa. So, you know, there is a bias there that, you know, we have to be aware of.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask a question. Are you there?
Yeah.
Hi, Fran. Very fine talk. Could you say something about your interaction with scholars in the Muslim world as a historian of Islam?
Sure. Is there a particular issue or?
I'm just curious whether you are part of a larger community that includes Muslim scholars, or whether they're pretty separate from what you do.
Oh, for sure. Well, you know, I guess first of all, I would distinguish, right, or just, you know, I'll be specific about, you know, whether we're talking about Muslim, you know, scholars who are historians today in the United States or you know, many parts of the world, and then you know, historians and other scholars specifically, say in the Middle East countries that I study. Because there are certainly many people from international backgrounds as well as American backgrounds who are, you know, Muslim or Middle East, right? Other religions, right? Who teach in American universities today and Canadian and European universities, and have really kind of changed the face of Middle East studies and Islamic studies in the last few decades for the better. When it comes though to people teaching in universities, right, in, you know, whether it's the Middle East or South Asia, there are interesting differences there in kind of the kind of scholarly and university kind of traditions within which they write. So, you know, to take one example, people who teach in Egyptian universities are often much more closely in conversation with the tradition of nationalist historiography in that country, whether, you know, as kind of proponents of that view of history or as critics of it. Likewise, in Turkey, there are very specific and strong kind of taboos and limitations on what can be said about certain topics. The Armenian genocide is, I think, the most famous example of that. And of course, you know, Turkish academics have lived, you know, under a kind of continued purge since the failed July coup, right, against Erdogan several years ago. So, you know, there are conditions, I guess, what I'm saying of the academic freedom that are perilous, and especially in some of the Middle East countries, that, you know, affect the way that people are able to do their work, but they still absolutely participate and are read by, you know, and have to be read by historians in this country, other scholars in this country, in part because they just have so much more, you know, access, you know, whether it's in terms of archival access or field work, right? So they absolutely, despite the sometimes difficult circumstances under which they're working, they do really important and kind of field defining work. I would say one of the most interesting historians that I kind of look to in thinking about, at least about kind of disease in the Middle East in a historical way, is Khalid Fahmy, who teaches in the UK right now at Cambridge. He's one of the leading historians of Egypt and one of the leading Egyptian historians of kind of this generation, the last kind of 30 years, 40 years. And he, you know, will blog and kind of write and give interviews and kind of talk about what's going on right now in Egypt in particular, in addition to his kind of historical work on disease in Egyptian society. Deb, if there aren't other questions, should we wrap up?
I have a question.
Great.
Okay, are you familiar with the work of Avital Livni, who is the daughter of Meron Livni and who has written about Turkey as a professor at the University of Illinois?
She's in Champaign and she just published a book.
Yes, did you want me to talk about it is there a question about it, or?
Well, I just wondered what your reaction to the book is and what your reaction to her work is.
Yeah, I mean, she's not really in my field, I would say, in terms of what I study, as an anonymous. So I can't say I have a really specific response to her work. But maybe when the pandemic ends, we can bring her to UW for a talk and have more of a discussion.
Well, yeah, you can invite each other to talks at your respective schools.
Yeah.
So.
That sounds very fair.
Who is she?
The daughter
what
of
is
Miron,
the discussion?
Professor at the University of Illinois.
Miron's daughter.
Miron Livny's daughter.
Okay, but that doesn't tell me what she's written about and why you're asking about her.
Because she's lived in Turkey and written about Turkey, and therefore that speaks to one segment of Muslim communities.
Okay, thank you.
And there's a lot going on there in terms of trying to undo Christian influences in Turkey. In fact, freedom of religion in Turkey.
Yeah, I believe she's a political scientist, if I'm not mistaken. Who studies kind of religious movements and kind of social mobilization in the contemporary Middle East, including Turkey.
Thanks for that clarification. Appreciate it.
So Roz, I put her name in the chat room, and she's at the University of Chicago. She's at Champaign, so you could look her up.
University of Illinois, right? Yeah.
University of Illinois.
I have a question. What about, so you're a actively identified Jew studying Islam, and the author that Sai just mentioned also is. Could you comment on, I mean, kind of both ways, Jews studying Islam and Muslims studying Judaism? Is there much of that going in each direction? And any thoughts? I don't know, I haven't framed the question real.
Yeah, I mean, I think Jews are like, there's a long tradition of Jewish people in Islamic studies, going back to, going back to kind of the genesis of Islamic studies, certainly in kind of Europe and North America. People like S.D. Goitein, right, kind of worked on the Cairo Geniza, right? Joseph Shah, some of the early scholars of Islamic law. I think in terms of Muslims who, are working on, so it's not unusual at all, is what I'm saying, to be like a Jewish person working on Islamic history. In terms of Muslims, who are working in Jewish studies, I mean, Jewish studies, especially in North America, is, pretty heavily dominated by Jews. There are interesting programs, and here again, I'm kind of reverting to thinking about the Middle East. There are, programs that in Jewish history and Jewish studies, for example, in Egypt, which have attracted a lot of interest in those countries, as part of the politics of engagement with Israel, since the 1970s. So there is actually a fairly robust program of Jewish and Israeli studies in Egypt in particular. I don't know as much about other countries, right? But it is definitely, something that people study and, can learn Hebrew and study Jewish history in Egyptian universities.
Just interesting, thank you.
So we are at the 11:15 mark, and I don't even have to look for adjectives to thank our featured speaker, Daniel Stolz, because I just took the adjectives from the chat room from our listeners. Fabulous, great, fantastic, well done, very interesting, excellent. So Daniel, thank you very much. And also very much thank you to our Kolot Kehilla organizers and brunch menu culinarians, Barry Rich and Adrian Borisi Gross. Please mark your calendars for Sunday, January 10th. Mark Koplovich is our next Kolot Kehilla presenter. And then Sunday, April 11th, will be Kathy Johnson Rock and Michael Rock at the turn of spring. Hummingbirds, it would be wonderful to think that we could do it in person, but we will keep our fingers crossed for everyone. And just a plug for, let's face it, Hanukkah is starting on Thursday night. Every night of Hanukkah, we're meeting at 6:30 to 6:45 to light candles and to enjoy the entertainment of actually some of you on Zoom right now. And then Erev Friday, Shabbat, is going to be starting at the end of Kabbalat Shabbat services from 3:50 to 4:04. We'll have the candle lighting, and then we will wish each other well. So thank you everyone for joining, and it was amazing, Dan. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you
Dan,
all so much.
beautiful.
Thanks
Thank you,
so much.
Yasher Koach.